Now, let me begin by a word of appreciation and for the college administration, for the organizers, for the faculty, and for the students who thought of organizing this seminar on a very seminal topic. This topic is of great contemporary relevance. Students of English literature and sociology and other subjects of social sciences very well know that marginality and margin are so very important points of discourses in today's context. Considering and appreciating what has been happening around, especially in the post-colonial scenario, this word marginal acquires great relevance in our lives as of now. Marginal is not marginal in the sense that if you look at the page of a book, and if you do not have margins on the page of the book, the content will not appear as pleasant as it should appear. Which makes me to say that without the margin, actually the center cannot stand and cannot appear in all its vibrancy and all its beauty. But that's the very literal meaning of marginal, whereby you think of things which are on the outskirts, on the periphery. So what I want to say is that periphery matters, that the margins matter. And that is why we talk of the margins today and the marginal today. And that is how it has acquired such great importance in modern literary studies, especially in the post-colonial era. It has a political implication as well. Say, for example, if you think of elections, you say that someone has won by a margin of so and so. So this margin also matters there. It has a political meaning apart from its literal meaning and apart from its other meanings that it carries. It also has an economic meaning whereby you say that there is a marginal profit here and a marginal profit there. So this margin keeps on haunting us day in and day out in a variety of disciplines, in a variety of exercises of the day-to-day life that we have. Margin actually contains or refers to an extra amount of something such as time or space or money. Marginal time, marginal space, or marginal money, that is the amount of profit that one gets or the amount of loss that one incurs. It includes, it has multiple implications, and it really impacts us, our lives, day in and day out in a variety of contexts. These contexts are social, political, economic, cultural, and also in the literary arena. That margin matters a lot. So in having said this as the introductory part of my talk, I just wanted to emphasize upon the subject that margin matters. And without margin, the center does not exist. So this became a subject of great discourse, especially in the post-colonial world. And if you look at India, and especially during the past 3 decades or more, to marginalize means to make somebody feel as if he or she is not important or relevant. In order to make decisions or influence decisions or events which may be political or which may be social or which may be cultural. To be marginal is to put somebody in a position in which they have no power, that they cannot defend themselves, that they are of little consequence in the socio-political order or in the economic order of any nation state. So the marginal groups do not necessarily endorse the notion of a fixed center. And that is the important point we need to take note of. And I repeat that the marginal groups do not necessarily endorse the notion of a fixed center. The students of literature and the faculty members know very well that during the past 3 decades or more in India, we have been talking of the center and the periphery. This periphery you can rename as margin. And this has been a discourse all agog and everywhere we have been talking, especially in the Indian context these days. The center and the margin equations work in a very complex manner. There are theoretical discussions about this, and there are, say, various aspects to it which relate with sociology. which relate with history, which relate with political science, or you say politics, and of course, it relates with literature. So the marginal indicates a positionality which is defined by limitations and the subject's access to power. The subject that is on the margin has no access to power. And that is where the problem arises. And that is why this discourse becomes important. Because the margin is trying to defigure or to disconfigure or to harp upon or to take over the center which has long existed there and has influenced lives in manners which are very, very consequential. It has been a subject of interest and great discourse to sociologists, to historians, to subaltern, to the political scientists, to the economists, the philosophers, the sociologists, and the cultural study groups. What I want to emphasize is this, that this margin is so significant that it has almost taken over all disciplines in our situation, that is in our country. That is sociology and politics and literature and economics and all that we get around day and day. It also influences, it also takes or counts for the interest of the anthropologists and the feminists and the Marxists. So to say that it has almost taken over all the disciplines and it has become a point of great discourse in all these disciplines that we are talking about today. What caused this debate of the margin and the center? It became important because when we started thinking of the post-colonial world all over the world, because we know that the major portions of this earth were colonized. So once the process of decolonization started, this this debate about the margin and the center started. It came into focus and it became the essential, say, concern of engagement. And everywhere we started talking about this. So it is a part of the post-colonial studies, and it's the advent of the democratic world order which the margin celebrates today. As I said, the advent of the democratic order. So it is a point of reasserting or asserting and reasserting one's own personality, one's own being, and one's own phenomenon, so to say, if you will. Now, what is important for us to take note of, in how many ways does this margin and center makes impact upon our lives? There has been a tug as if, there has been a tussle as if, and this tussle is so important for us to take note of. For example, when we think of center, we immediately think of periphery, which is, we think of margins, which is important critically, and that is why we as students of literature engage with this idea so very frequently. Margin also matters in another sociological manner. For example, when you think of majority, you think of the minorities also, which is on the margin, and it wants to take the center stage, so the tussle is there. This margin also becomes important when we talk of the civilized in opposition to the savage. So the savage and the civilized, the center and the periphery, the majority and the minority, these are some of the manifestations of this margin that we come across day in and day out. But that is not all. We have other aspects also to this margin periphery and the margin center equation. For example, when we think of the bourgeois society, we think of the proletariat, which is the margin. Similarly, when we think of the settled colonies, we also think of the settler colonies, which is thinking of the margins. And that is how it becomes such an important discourse for us. Similarly, when we think of the West, we think of the East, that is the margin, which is also becoming such an important geographical location. In other words, or in yet another dimension of it is that when we think of the white, we think of the black and the brown, which means we think of the marginal or we think of the peripheral at the same time. Thinking of it in a different manner, when we think of the male, we also think of the female, which had been on the margins for a long time. So you know how the social scientists and the anthropologists and the historians have been taking note of all these considerations. Putting it in a different manner, when you think of the unipolar world, you think also of the bipolar world. So you can imagine in how many ways the center margin equation works. And that is why it has become a subject of great discourse in our times. Taking this thesis further, I can say that when you think of the native, you also think of the diasporic, which is spread all over the world these days. So you cannot take one into consideration at the cost of the other. So diaspora is an important point of concern. And the post-colonial students know it very well. And there is so much of research going on in the diaspora. It is happening these days. Similarly, when you think of the colonial, you think of the post-colonial, that is the margin. And then we think of the post-colonial. In other words, when you think of the developed, you also think of the underdeveloped and the developing. So these are the various manifestations of the underprivileged and the underdeveloping. Then, if you think of the first world, you immediately think of the second world, which is on the margin, and the third world, which is still far greater on the margin. So there are so many manifestations of it. And at the last, I would say that when you think of the subjugated, the subaltern, the marginalized, this has become the center, and this has become. In other words, what I was trying to say is that margin has impacted our lives in a very different manner. It didn't margin, it didn't appear become, it didn't at all become so very significant in the earlier decades. Let me summarize it once again, that in how many ways this margin and this periphery works. When you think of the center and the periphery, the majority and the minority, the civilized and the savage, the bourgeois and the proletariat, the settler and the settled, the west and the east, the white and the black, the male and the female, the unipolar and the bipolar, the native and the diasporic, the colonial and the post-colonial and the neo-colonial, the developed and the developing and the underdeveloped, the privileged and the underprivileged, and the unprivileged, the first world and the second world and the third world, the subjugated and the subaltern. These are the various manifestations of the margin. Now it has taken the center stage in all the disciplines which I was talking about a while ago, apart from the discipline to which we come from which we come, that is English. But in all literary studies, sociological studies, anthropological studies, scientific studies as well, all these things are becoming the important points of consideration, especially this has happened during the past 3 or 4 decades, as I said. Now, the word power is at the center of it. Who enjoys this power? Who has the capacity to control? Who has the capacity to rule over? Who has the capacity to subjugate? And is the subjugated, the controlled, and the dominated over? Any kind of a control do they have over themselves to come out of this suffering and to reclaim themselves? This whole business in the past 3 or 4 decades, if as it happened in India, it has been a way of understanding this kind of a dichotomy that we have. It implies control over resources. The marginalized wants to control the resources, wants to have the political control, wants to have to come out of the coercion, and wants to be out of this persuasion that it has played upon their lives, and through persuasion they have been marginalized. It is an exercise of resistance. In marginal literatures, you will see, and the literatures of margin, you will see, if I put it in a better manner, the literatures which engage with the issues of the margins, you will see that there is an effort, there is a resistance, and there's a dream, and there is a desire to reclaim oneself, to reassure oneself, to challenge the power as a power subject, and the primary features of the post-colonial discourse. This has been greatly and in a very big way theorized by several European and thinkers and philosophers and theoreticians. For example, Althusser has written about this margin and the center, and you have Gramsci and you have Foucault. They have problematized the subjectivity of the agents and the subjects and the power of relationship that has gone by. Intentionality is the major force behind this point of margin and this equal margin and center relationship. Effectiveness is achieved through apparatus of the state, and that is how you go and control, and that is how you try to make your claim and reclaim yourself. Now, this resistance to power is all that matters in the case of the marginal people and the marginal societies and the marginal cultures. They resist against the agencies of power through their word, through their action, and also through their writings. It implies opposition, it implies refusal to accept to be a margin any further, and it leads to a counter discourse, which is very important, which has come up in recent days. It leads to a counter discourse. The contexts involved in this case are therefore the place against displacement. So you have been, the margins, people on the margin have been displaced. Now they are looking for the place. They are looking for difference in the midst of universality. Universality has been there all along. Universality has been all that has been taken about, has been talked about. But this is the difference from that from that universality that this marginal people or the marginal cultures are trying to reclaim themselves with. It thinks of resistance against representation. Representation has had a very clear modus operandi. Means in a literary text, a particular social custom, suppose if it is represented in a fiction, in a piece of fiction, in a story or in a novel as you read, suppose for example a birthday or any ritual, social ritual or any custom. Now there is a certain way of representing that, but the marginal representations are different. So far, they have been asked to believe this is how a birthday is celebrated, this is how a funeral is celebrated, because this is what is there in the established societies. But the marginal societies had different ways of doing it, and therefore they tried to reassert themselves, their customs and their manners and their traditions. So it is a way of reclaiming and reasserting oneself to tell the tale in a different way, to be substance, to summon substances, to tell the tale in a different way. It's creating new myths as against the old myths. So it's a way of mythicizing the society, the social norms and the orders. The new myths are important myths, and they challenge the older myths, which represent society in a certain fixed framework, which could not be shaken so far. But only in the post-colonial world, the shaking of the frame has taken place. New historicists and historiographies and the old histories and the old historiographies, these are all being challenged. The manners of writing history, for example, the manners of developing a literary representation, for example, is all that matters today. And that is why it is a huge subject of discourse in the post-colonial world, in the universities of the post-colonial world, especially the students. As for example, in India, we do engage with all these questions much more vigorously than we ever engaged with them earlier. So in all said and done, you would appreciate that identity is the basic point in the discourse of margin. One may be identified with the one's socio-cultural markers and one's historical signs. This is what the marginal people are, or the marginal societies are trying to impress upon. The philosophical icons, the linguistic configurations, and the myths, they are trying to reclaim and to establish this. They are trying to develop their own phrase and their own ways of thinking, developing their own idiom and finding their own language. You would consider that also depends on who puts this question. Who is asking us about the identity? This question is a very wide question, is a very open question. It's a very important question. Who is asking about our identity? The identities differ. The person who is asking may be a person controlling, and a person who is controlling will not take the answer easy if you give them a straight way. So who is asking this question is important. At what point of time this question is being asked about the identity is very important. At what juncture of history this question is being put is of very great interest and importance. Is it being asked by a diplomat, by a politician, by a bureaucrat, by a social scientist, by a cultural icon, by a historian, by an artist, or by a common man? Each answer will be different. Each question will be different coming from these people, and each answer also will be different. What I'm trying to emphasize upon is that asking about identity has various ramifications and various manners of putting this question to people. So, who is asking this question? Who are you? And who is answering this question? Who am I? This is all that is about margin and about the center periphery, that is to say, the center periphery dichotomy in the relationship. Identity changes with time, so the identity of the margin has changed with time. It is changes with place and the conditions in which a particular place is associated with, which is also changing. And same may have several identities. The same person may have several identities. For example, I as a teacher, I as a father, I as a writer, I as a citizen, and I as an internationalist. So you all have these various facets. Now, these marginal people, these marginal societies have come up with these kinds of questions to engage with and to engage with. So it becomes an important issue of discourse in the modern times. When the peripheral identity chose to sit next to the central identity. This is very important. Peripheral identity chose to sit next to the central identity, when the spirit of decolonization made way through the colonial hegemony, the challenge to the colonial hegemony, when the world shrank, when the people got mobile, and when they mixed up with others, and when they got reminded of their own identity. So this question of identity in the case of the marginalized societies and the marginal people and the margins is so very important, and it's being asked from different quarters, in different manners, in different languages. But the margins have developed their own language, their own ways of thinking. It is coming up in the text that we engage with today. I will just give you to begin to finish my brief talk to you, a very basic brief talk to you. I'll just give you a few examples by which you can just catch hold of what this margin, periphery, center, periphery discourse is all about. So, for example, if you think of margins in political terms in a literary text, you can think of Pash, the poetry of Pash. You can think of the fiction by Shulal Shukla, that is has been selling. It's a Hindi novel, Rag Darbari, and this is a very wonderful example in Hindi and in Punjabi by Paush, where you can understand this dichotomy of the center and the margin. If you look at the gender question, Premchand would come very handy to you. He writes so much about this marginal societies and the marginal woman and the sex. For example, in the Urdu short stories, in the Hindi, in Urdu short stories, you have Premchand, and in the Urdu short stories, you have Ismat Choktai. There also, this gender becomes so very important, and how this gender is reasserting, how this woman and this female figure is reasserting itself. If you think of the socio-cultural aspects of this marginality, you have wonderful novels by Abdul Bismillah, Jini Jini Bini Chadariya. If you look at this novel, you will find how the margin exists, how it tries to, and how it aspires to find its place, and how it is all the time before being. So these are some of the examples. For example, in the fictions of Mohsin Hamid, you will also find this kind of marginalization of the social system or social or a group. If you think of the ethnic marginalities, you have the poetry of Namdev Dhasal, you have the works of Pama, and you have the works of Mahashata Devi, which you are all about. So, friends, these were some of the observations which I wanted to make at the beginning of your conference, so that you can develop your own perspectives on the center, on the margin, on the questions of identity, on the questions of power and the powerlessness, on the questions to reassert oneself with some account. But more importantly, for a literary critic of which we are all the students of literature, we will know that this marginal societies, as represented in a literary text, they are looking for their own language. So, in a way, one could probably assert that the marginal societies, especially with relation to the literary text in the marginal societies, we also need to understand how our language works and how we develop our own linguistic framework, whereby we can communicate with other society and develop our own understanding of the social order. Friends, I wanted to be brief because you have so many other speakers coming before you. They're already delayed. So I would just take leave of you and I would say thanks before I get. Thank you very much.